Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so yeah, Antonia, why don't we just crack on? And I think you're going to speak for up to 40 minutes, and then we've got 20 minutes there for Q&A.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Can everyone see my screen all right? You should be seeing a little graphic with RAFT in the bottom right corner.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me today. My name is Antonia Khayatt. I'm an architect, and I work for RAFT, which stands for Retrofit Action for Tomorrow. And we're a not-for-profit community enterprise, and we were founded about 3 years ago by Harry Patikas. And our aim in life is to help communities and in particular schools to get their buildings towards zero carbon. And we think the best way to do that is to combine consultancy advice with community engagement and education. Because if we want to decarbonise our buildings, it's not just simply a technical issue around retrofitting buildings, but we also need to change how we use and manage our buildings. And we've focused on schools because they are very central to local communities. And so if we help schools decarbonise and we, in the process, educate children and staff about how to use their buildings and make them more energy efficient and more sustainable, that message will leak out to the broader community. So we think we have quite a big impact in that way. So whilst we're an architect-led practice, we do have engineers and teachers in our team as well. And we've done quite a lot of work on individual schools, but also some houses and other building types like a museum. But we're also doing quite a lot of front-end estate-wide planning. So something I've been involved in a lot is looking at all the schools across a council's estate or an academy, a trust, or a sort of diocesan board of education, and analysing all those schools, what the status of those existing schools are and what they need to do to get them to zero carbon. And as a sort of consequence of a lot of this work, both the consultancy work and the education work, we've ended up by inherently falling into doing some research and into sort of producing guidance and resources for schools and organisations. And what I'm going to talk about today is some research that was funded by the Department for Education that came out of some work we did for Lewisham Council to retrofit 5 of their existing primary schools. So we produced zero carbon action plans for all 5 of the schools, and then they went ahead and did phase 1 of those action plans for 3 of them. So we oversaw the works on 3 of them. But before I delve into the study, I just want to give a tiny bit of context. We all know that we're facing a climate emergency, and we know that we need to get to the UK to zero carbon, and we need to do it without blowing our carbon budget in the process. There are about 30,000 schools in the UK, and most of them, like the majority of our building stock, have gas and oil boilers and aren't particularly energy efficient. So the question we ask ourselves often is, how do we get those 30,000 schools to zero carbon whilst minimising their carbon emissions on the way? So minimising their whole life carbon emissions. And I'll admit that this study is very limited. It only looks at 5 schools, not 30,000. But I do think a lot of the findings are relevant to other schools across the country. So the 5 schools we looked at are all primary schools, and they all comprise a mix of buildings of different ages, and a mix of extensions and refurbishments added over time. And that's pretty typical of most of the schools we work on. Almost every school is a hodgepodge of buildings and extensions and refurbishments from different periods of time. So you get a lot of different typologies within schools. Now, there's a huge amount of material, resource and embodied carbon bound up in those existing schools. And I think it is worth just reflecting briefly on what the kind of embodied carbon within the school is relative to its annual operational carbon. And that's what this little graphic at the bottom is trying to describe. If you were to rebuild that school today using the same materials, they'd all have about between 10 and 20 times the embodied carbon in the existing school as they have in their annual operational carbon emissions, their existing ones, that is. So it would take you 10 to 20 years of operational carbon emissions to sort of add up to being the same as the existing embodied carbon in those buildings. So as I mentioned, we prepared zero carbon action plans for these 5 schools, and these were phased plans. It's pretty disruptive was very disruptive to retrofit a whole school in one go, and also funding is very limited. So we sort of assume that most schools will be retrofitted over time in a sort of phased manner. And we proposed a suite of measures to these schools. So wall and roof insulation was proposed, not floor insulation, that was considered too difficult for the schools. Replacing all windows with triple glazing, improving air tightness, installing mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, replacing gas boilers with heat pumps, electrifying kitchens, replacing hot water storage, centralized hot water storage with point of use hot water, and ensuring all lights LEDs. Those are the sorts of measures we're talking about. So in other words, we're talking about deep retrofit. And in 3 of the schools, we carried out phase 1 works. And we would typically concentrate either on one building within the school or an area of a building within the school. So, for example, at Dow Main School, we replaced the roof, which was in terrible shape. We put in some triple glazed roof lights. We put in MVHR. We put in an air source heat pump, and we filled the walls with cavity wall insulation. Those are the sorts of measures we're talking about, and it's just worth bearing that in mind when I refer to retrofit for the duration of this talk. So our report, we basically produced a report back in May this year for the Department for Education, and it will go up onto our website in the next week, so you'll be able to have a look at it if you want to. And that report covered 2 studies. The main study was to look at whole life carbon over 60 years, of all the 5 schools. But we also did a side study where we looked at the embodied carbon of the as-built phase 1 retrofit works that we did in 3 of the schools. I'm not going to look at that bit today. I'm just going to talk about the overall whole life carbon assessment, just because of time. So at the risk of telling you something you already know, I do want to clarify what we mean by whole life carbon, embodied carbon, and operational carbon. So embodied carbon is the carbon emissions associated with building a building in the first place, and then maintaining it throughout its life, and then demolishing and disposing of the building at the end of its life. Operational carbon is the carbon emissions associated with consuming energy and water in the building throughout its life. And in this study, we refer to 3 modules, A, B, and C. There is a 4th called D, but we didn't go into that module in the study. That's when you're sort of recycling buildings at the end of their life to be sort of reused in a different location. So A, the life cycle A is upfront admission. Oh, can you hear me okay? My headset's gone a bit weird.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, sorry. It just flashed up on, and can you see my default speakers thing? Yeah, it flashed up on the screen a bit weird. Anyway, so in all 3 of those modules, so upfront emissions, in-use emissions, and end-of-life emissions, you will have embodied carbon. And so it's therefore important to always be clear on whether you're talking about upfront embodied carbon, which is module A, or life cycle embodied carbon, which is modules A to C. Whereas operational carbon, you'll only really have in module B. Okay, now we've assumed a study period of 60 years, which is industry standard for whole life carbon research in this study. So as I mentioned, we calculated the whole life carbon of each of the 5 schools for 5 different scenarios. So scenario 1 is do nothing, where we don't undertake any retrofit or energy measures at start. However, in 2035, we do assume that boilers are replaced by air source heat pumps and new windows are installed. And that might seem a bit perverse for the do nothing scenario, but we think it's not realistic to suggest that over the next 60 years, neither the windows nor the heating systems in a school will be replaced. And we chose 2035 as the replacement year because all 5 of the schools have windows that are already nearing the end of life. And because at the time of this study, the government had a commitment to phase out all gas boilers by 2035. As many of you are aware, Rishi's now scrapped that plan. But anyway, that was why we do have changes to the buildings in 2035 in the do nothing scenario. In the second scenario, scenario 2, which we call air source heat pump only, the only thing we do in 2022 at the start of our study period is replace all the gas boilers with an air source heat pump. So we don't take any energy efficiency measures. We just put in an air source heat pump. But we do also replace the windows in 2035, as with the do nothing scenario. Under scenario 3, the phased retrofit, the measures vary slightly for each of the 5 schools, but they by and large follow those, all the measures that I outlined just above. And so they combine a mix of different measures of what we would call deep retrofit. All the graphs in the report that you're going to see are based on retrofits being phased out over 8 to 10 years. We think we've done that because we think schools across the country are far more likely to be retrofitted in phases over time rather than all in one go. But we did also examine the impact of retrofitting all in one go, and I'll touch on that later. And then the last 2 scenarios, scenarios 4 and 5, involve demolishing all the buildings and replacing them with new buildings of the same size. And under scenario 5, under scenario 4, the new building is typical and it meets building regulations Part L, and it sort of is fairly standard in terms of embodied carbon. But under scenario 5, you build an exemplary building. So you are meeting the DFE's ambitious targets for operational energy use, for energy use intensity, and you're also meeting LETI and RIBA targets for exemplary low embodied carbon. Now, unfortunately, we did have to use 2 different assessments or methodologies for comparing the different scenarios. So for the first 3, we used the RICS methodology for calculating whole life carbon. That was the first edition. The second edition came out after we'd done this study. So we built 3D models and energy models of all the buildings in each of the schools. And from that, we could calculate the operational energy use and therefore the operational carbon, both in their existing state and with the different retrofit measures applied. And from those models, we were also able to extract detailed information on materials and services in order to calculate the embodied carbon. However, we didn't do this for the 2 new build scenarios, mainly because we hadn't modeled those scenarios. We hadn't actually designed a new build school. So what we did is applied sensible meter squared rates using sort of RIBA and LETI targets, and also DFE targets for operational. So before I delve into the findings, I do want to point out there are some sort of limitations to the study, and this is with the sort of attempt to be as honest and transparent as possible about its limitations. Whole life carbon is quite an emerging science, and the assumptions one makes at all stages of the calculations can skew the results. So the operational carbon calculations, for example, for scenarios 1, 2, and 3 are really dependent on having accurate energy models. We used PHPP, which is the Passive House Planning Package. So it's a very well-established energy model, but nevertheless, you have to accept that small changes on assumptions, for example, like how often is your heating, how long is the heating put on for, can have a big impact on energy use. So we always try to make sensible assumptions, and they're all detailed in the report, but it's just something to bear in mind. Similarly, embodied carbon calculations are depending on having accurate embodied carbon data for materials and services. And we use the carbon calculator PH Ribbon, which is you can get from the AECB website. And that has a very extensive database of manufacturers, as well of manufacturers' EPDs, as well as generic embodied carbon information. For scenarios 4 and 5, as I mentioned before, we used the DFE EUI targets in order to calculate our operational carbon, and we used LETI and RAFT, LETI and RIBA rates for embodied carbon. So we just applied square meter rates, and again tried to make sensible assumptions on that. The other thing I want to point out is that operational carbon calculations are massively influenced by the carbon factors you assume for your gas and electricity. So we followed the RICS methodology, and I think it's worth noting that we used carbon factors that don't just include generation emissions, but also well to tank and transmission and distribution emissions. So that means the carbon factors are sort of higher than a lot of people use in studies. So with that, even with those limitations in mind, I just want to point out that the way we've tried to overcome it is being very honest and transparent about all our assumptions. So if you read the report, you can see it all written down. But also, we tend to present general trends and patterns rather than precise numbers. So on to what we found with these 5 schools. These graphs show the whole life carbon emissions for each of the 5 schools for each of the 5 scenarios. So scenario 1 being do nothing, through to scenario 5, which is demolish and new build exemplary. And yellow is the embodied carbon, and turquoise is the operational carbon, and the dashed turquoise box indicates the reduction in operational carbon due to having electricity generated by on-site PV. So you can see that in some of the schools we've able to get much more PV in than in other schools. Now, whilst the total whole life carbon varies between the schools, the same pattern is evident in all of the schools. Scenarios 2 and 3, which are the air source heat pump only and phased retrofit scenarios, they always have the lowest whole life carbon emissions. The scenario 4, which is the demolish and rebuild with a typical building, always has the highest whole life carbon emissions, and scenarios 1 and 5, scenario 1 being do nothing until 2035, and scenario 5 being build an exemplary building, sit in the middle. That's just a quick summary of what I've said to help you reflect, and I will actually, I have this throughout the presentation sort of to help people process what I've just said. So if we look at the cumulative emissions over time, we can sort of go into a bit more detail about what's going on. So these graphs show for each of the scenarios, so different colours are different scenarios. The blue ones are the new build, the grey ones are the air source heat pump only and do nothing scenarios, and the green one is the phased retrofit scenario. And this is showing from 2022 through until 2080 to the cumulative emissions over time. And what you can see is that the high upfront carbon emissions, embodied carbon that is, in 2022 for the 2 new build scenarios, takes a long time for that to be clawed back by having lower operational carbon emissions. So even though the other scenarios all have higher operational carbon emissions, this upfront carbon isn't paid back for, is never paid back for a typical rebuild, and is only sometimes paid back in the exemplary rebuild over a 60-year period. The second thing worth noting is that if you look at the dark line, that's the do nothing scenario where we put an air source heat pump in only in 2035, and prior to that nothing is done to the building. And we can see that emissions rise really, really steeply before 2035, and then sort of slow down massively. And that's simply the impact of replacing the gas boilers in 2035 by an air source heat pump. Just want to point out that in all the other scenarios, we've assumed all electric buildings with air source heat pumps. Thirdly, on all the scenarios, you can see that the rise in emissions is less steep after the 2030s, and that reflects the decarbonisation of the national grid. And the fourth thing I want to point out is that on the green line, which is our retrofit scenario, you can see a big spike in emissions at around the sort of 2060 period. And that's because that's where we're putting in new PV. We're assuming that the PV needs to be replaced after 40 years. And PV, as I'll talk about later, has very high embodied carbon. So in our retrofit scenarios, we have assumed always the replacement of major plant like MVHR and PV and air source heat pumps. So they are getting replaced on a regular basis. So yeah, just to re-summarize, the high embodied carbon of the new build scenarios is seldom recouped. Replacing gas with air source heat pumps has an enormous impact. The emissions will start to rise slower as the grid decarbonizes, and the air source heat pump only scenario and the retrofit scenario don't seem that different. But I think it's worth delving into that in a bit more detail. So when you look at these, so I'm just going to go back. When you look at these graphs, it doesn't look like doing a phased retrofit makes a huge impact in terms of whole life carbon compared to, they're fairly similar to one another. But the reality is, because we did our phased retrofit over time, that makes a big impact. So just let me explain that a bit better, sorry. We looked at the impact of retrofitting one of the schools, Torridon, not over a number of phases over 8 to 10 years, but also all in one go, and either 2022 or in 2032. So this graph here on the left is trying to show the cumulative emissions of doing your phased retrofit, which is the kind of bluey green line, doing just putting in an air source heat pump in 2022, doing your entire retrofit in 2022, or waiting until 2032 when you do your retrofit. So don't do anything for 10 years and then retrofit. What you can see is that 10-year gap in retrofit makes all the difference. So if you retrofit now, you will massively reduce your carbon emissions than if you wait 10 years in terms of your whole life carbon emissions. And there are a number of reasons for this. The first is that if you replace a reasonably efficient boiler with a reasonably efficient air source heat pump in 2022, you'll halve the annual carbon emissions. So straight away, you've massively reduced your operational carbon emissions because air source heat pumps are so much more efficient. And each year, as the electricity grid decarbonizes, that reduction in carbon emissions is even greater. So by 2035, your air source heat pump emissions will be almost as little as 10% of your emissions from a gas boiler. So you've got this cumulative improvement in emissions reductions as a result of having an air source heat pump. The second reason that the 10-year timing is critical is that if you improve the energy efficiency of a building today, you'll benefit from 10 years of lower energy consumption at a time when the grid has quite high carbon emissions. And thirdly, due to grid decarbonisation, the relative benefit of PV diminishes over time. So if you install PV today, you're going to save far higher carbon emissions than if you install them in, say, 10 years' time. That's what that image on the right is about. So in short, if you delay by 10 years, you're basically losing out of 10 years worth of emission savings at a time when every kilowatt hour of electricity saved or generated means a big saving in carbon emissions. So in short, you want to retrofit as soon as possible. And in particular, we need to get air source heat pumps in as quickly as possible. So I'd now just like to look in detail at where embodied carbon is expended under the air source heat pump only and the phased retrofit scenarios. So this graph shows all 5 schools for those 2 scenarios. I'm clustering the 2 scenarios under each of the 5 schools. So the first thing to note is that the green, red and blue bars tend to be the biggest in all 5 schools. And what that means is that so the green is PV, the red is air source heat pumps and the blue is windows. So those are what I would consider the embodied carbon big hitters and therefore the ones we need to be careful about. The second thing to note is that if you ignore PV, so the green box, the embodied carbon of the phased retrofit is lower than that of the air source heat pump only scenario. And that's despite the fact that you've got many more measures being carried out. So even though you've got all this insulation going in and MVHR and air tightness measures and all of that, you've still got a lower embodied carbon. And the reason for this is because you've made the buildings more energy efficient and you've reduced their heat loads. And so as a consequence, you can install much smaller air source heat pumps. And you can also hopefully retain existing radiators, although that's not a given. And so as a result, you can make big savings in the embodied carbon of your heating system. And so it's very important, if you want to reduce the embodied carbon of a retrofit, you really want to focus on reducing the embodied carbon of your heating system by minimizing heat loads. So I'm just going to look back at, I'm going to look at the embodied carbon of the main retrofit measures in turn. So heat pumps, to put it simply, the bigger the heat pump, the bigger the embodied carbon. So at Dalmain, the embodied carbon of the heat pump under the air source heat pump only scenario is 4 times that of the phased retrofit scenario, given the change in peak heat loads, basically. And it seems that the difference between individual pumps of a similar size isn't that huge, but what is important is the refrigerant that the air source heat pump uses. So all heat pumps use refrigerants, and the global warming potential of different refrigerants can change by, up to 2,000 times. So some is 2,000 times worse than others. And it is true that the government is phasing out the really bad refrigerants. So all those on this graph with a blue box around them are being phased out by the government. But still, from now, we really should be choosing refrigerants that are down at the 0, 10, 20 global warming potential mark, rather than the kind of 1,000 and 2,000 global warming potential mark. So my guidance would be minimize heat pump sizes and choose heat pumps with low global warming potential refrigerants. Moving on to PV, the life cycle embodied carbon of the PV is about the same as all the other retrofit measures combined. So PV has a massive impact on embodied carbon and therefore really needs to be considered carefully. Now, we used averaged embodied carbon data from 20 PVs, but if we'd used the worst performing PV, the embodied carbon would have doubled. So that is why I'm saying you've got to choose PV carefully, because there is quite a big difference between different manufacturers. This graph on the bottom shows you the embodied carbon of different PV panels per square meter. That's the green bars, but it also shows it per kilowatt. Sorry, it shows the watt peak per meter squared. So the output of the PV given the size of the PV per meter squared of PV panel. And so from that, if you look at the two, you can work out which manufacturers actually have the lowest embodied carbon given their output. And that's something worth looking into when choosing PV panels. I think it's worth pointing out that the transport emissions, which is the little grey box at the top of this bar chart, those are fairly minimal compared to the manufacturing emissions. And this is often the case in highly refined or manufactured products such as PV or windows. So when a huge amount of energy goes into the manufacture of the product, the transport emissions become much less important by comparison. Just be aware that that's not the case when you've got simpler and heavier materials such as, stone or aggregate, where the transport emissions suddenly become much more important. So my summary on PV would be choose PV panels with low embodied carbon relative to their watt peak output. Now moving on to windows, they're not as impactful as PV, but they're still a big contributor to embodied carbon. And like PV, there can be a huge variation in the embodied carbon of different window types, as you can see in the top graph. So the type that we use for whole life carbon study versus the worst performing window on the database that we used for embodied carbon. So I think it's interesting to point out that there doesn't appear to be a huge difference between double and triple glazing in terms of whole life carbon. The bottom graph shows upfront embodied carbon, and the middle graph shows the whole life carbon of the different window types at Downderry School, where over the phased retrofit, an awful lot of windows are being replaced. And whilst triple glazing tends to have higher upfront embodied carbon than double glazing, in terms of whole life carbon, they're broadly similar, and that's just because you improve your operation. You've got better energy efficiency with triple glazing than with double glazing. What really makes an impact on embodied carbon is the frame type. So you can see here that the aluminium framed windows are by far and away the worst than all the other frame types in terms of embodied carbon. So timber frame are the best, and timber frames clad in aluminium aren't bad either. So another thing worth noting is that replacing the windows at Downderry didn't seem to lead to big savings in whole life carbon compared with leaving the existing windows in place. So Downderry had double glazed windows, and replacing it with better double glazed or triple glazed windows didn't make a huge impact on whole life carbon. We didn't look properly at single glazed windows in the study, which is a mistake, and it was because of the fact that these 5 schools largely had double glazing in them. But we have done a bit of crude analysis since, and we think it is worth replacing single glazing single glazed windows with good double or triple glazing because of the energy savings you make. But from a whole life carbon perspective, we don't think it's worth replacing double glazed windows unless they're in very bad shape and cannot be repaired. So my summary would be is only replace windows if they're single glazed or end of life. Don't stress too much about double and triple when it comes to whole life carbon, but really care a lot about the frame type and avoid aluminium ones. I just want to go back with the double and triple glazing. When I say don't stress too much about which one you choose, I'm referring to whole life carbon. Obviously, there are sort of massive aesthetic, acoustic, energy performance and comfort issues to consider in choosing between double and triple glazing. But in terms of whole life carbon, it's maybe not that big a difference. Moving on to mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. This is something we advocate, not just to improve energy efficiency, but to improve air quality, indoor air quality, because there's huge amounts of research that shows that poor indoor air quality affects the ability to teach and to learn. And we think there's a lot of poor indoor air quality in a lot of existing schools, particularly in winter when the windows are closed. So MVHR is less important than heat pumps and PV in windows in terms of embodied carbon. It's not such a big hitter, but there was, that said, a little bit of variation between the 3 schools where we installed it. So we looked at the 3 schools where different MVHR systems went in to under the phase 1 retrofit works, and we came to the conclusion that centralized systems were probably a little bit lower in terms of embodied carbon than decentralized systems. But ultimately, we're aware that when it comes to MVHR, it's about designing the most efficient system that you can fit into your existing building, and sometimes that will need to be decentralized. The final retrofit measure I want to look at is insulation, which actually, compared to all the other measures, is quite a small contributor to embodied carbon, but it makes a huge impact on operational carbon, obviously, because you can massively reduce your energy loss from insulated buildings, well-insulated buildings. Now, this graph on the left is trying to show the life cycle embodied carbon of different types of insulation for a given thermal performance. So that's not about they're not comparing the same thickness of insulation, but the same thermal performance of insulation, the same sort of U value effectively. And what we can see is that your natural insulations all have really great upfront embodied carbon because of sequestration, but the life cycle ends up being, not necessarily brilliant because it will be released over time. So if you're locking in insulation forever, then that's brilliant. If you're planning on taking it out again in 30 years, maybe not so good. Mineral installations aren't too bad, although it varies massively. And then the petrochemicals are kind of in the middle, and the aerogels are the worst in terms of embodied carbon. But I think similar to MVHR, insulation choice is maybe likely to be led for other reasons rather than embodied carbon. So fire, moisture, space issues, and other constraints might have a much bigger impact on your choice of insulation than the embodied carbon. And I think, just to put it in perspective, the insulation embodied carbon is very small compared to air source heat pumps, windows, and PV. So if you're really focusing on embodied carbon, focus on those three, not more than insulation. Now, having looked at the different measures that go into retrofitting, I just want to step out briefly, and I know I need to finish in the next few minutes, because I think it's worth pointing out a few other things. So the first is that whole life carbon and zero operational carbon are not the same thing. And we need to always decide, what are we actually aiming for? What is more important? Is it more important to minimize whole life carbon, or is it more important to get to zero carbon? And to achieve zero carbon, you've got to minimize your energy consumption and maximize your on-site renewable energy generation. So the new build scenarios, particularly the exemplary building, are, with lots of PV on them, are going to be the closest to achieving operational zero carbon on site. But you'll have to expend a lot of embodied carbon in the process. And so the new build scenarios don't perform particularly well with respect to whole life carbon. By contrast, the air source heat pump only scenario isn't bad on whole life carbon, but it's not so good on achieving zero carbon on site. We haven't put in any PV, we haven't really reduced energy, we haven't improved the energy efficiency enormously because we haven't reduced heat loads and things like that. So it's the sort of phase 3 retrofit scenario where you kind of get to a middle ground of pretty good on very good on whole life carbon, but also getting close on zero carbon if you do a proper deep retrofit, that is. We've also looked very briefly at health and comfort, and also energy security and costs, and I'm just going to touch very briefly on those. So new build schools should be designed for good health and comfort, but many existing schools suffer from winter underheating and also actually winter overheating. They suffer from summer overheating and they suffer from poor air quality. And just installing air source heat pumps into these buildings will not solve those problems. You need measures such as insulation, new windows, and MVHR to improve the thermal comfort and indoor air quality in schools. We haven't done a full post-occupancy evaluation yet of these 3 schools because it's only just been a year since the retrofits were fully completed. You need a bit of time before you go back in. But we have talked to staff, and some of the classrooms have monitors tracking temperature and CO2 levels. And these graphs are from Dalmain School, and the graphs at the top were before MVHR went in. The graphs in the middle are after MVHR went in. And what we can see in the top graphs is that for long periods of time, or for a lot of the time, carbon dioxide levels within those classrooms are well over 1,000 or 1,500 parts per million for large parts of the day. Whereas when we get to our MVHR, once the MVHR has gone in, we're generally under 1,000 parts per million. And we sort of think that around 1,000 parts per million and less is okay, and the 1,500 and more is really not good. So the impact of the MVHR is quite significant, and you can really see that because on these 2 days here, when the MVHR was turned off, the parts per million shot up to 4,000 carbon dioxide levels. So the MVHR has a massive impact on improving classroom indoor air quality, we think. The second thing I wanted to talk about was energy security. So we know that reducing energy consumption as well as increasing national energy supply will help improve the UK's energy security. And we also know that peak heat loads are much, much higher than the capacity of the national grid. This graph on the left-hand side, which I've borrowed from someone else, illustrates this issue. So the red graph, the red elements are the UK's peak heat loads over the course of the year, and the grey is our electricity generation over the course of the year. So there's a massive gap between the two. And if we're going to switch everybody onto air source heat pumps, we massively need to reduce our peak heat loads in order to make that happen. To address these two issues, we need to do two things. We need to minimise energy consumption overall, but we also need to minimise peak heat loads in order to improve overall national security sort of on energy. The graph on the top right compares the energy use intensity of the different scenarios, and the green dashed boxes show the impact of on-site PV. In terms of energy use intensity, scenario 2, which is the air source heat pump only scenario, isn't that bad, and it's a lot better than our existing building. Okay, but if you look at space heat demand, the scenario 2 is still very high. It's a bit improved once you put an air source heat pump and new windows, but it's still very, very high. So if you want to reduce both energy consumption and peak heat loads, you can't just install air source heat pumps, okay? You need to be putting in other measures to reduce your peak heat loads. I also think it's worth pointing out that we don't think you get much lower energy use intensity or peak heat loads with most typical new builds compared to a good retrofit. I think that's an important point to make. So moving on to costs, we did a very crude analysis. Actually, you know what? I'm going to stop. I'm a bit worried about time.
That's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
To allow for the question.
I'm just going to go to this. We did do a look on costs, running costs and upfront costs. And if we look at these 5 scenarios across different aspects, so whole life carbon, upfront costs, running costs, health and comfort, and supporting grid decarbonisation, clearly the do nothing or the air source heat pump only scenarios are not great on running costs, health and comfort, and supporting grid decarbonisation for the reasons that I've just sort of explained. But then the new build scenarios aren't good on whole life carbon or on upfront costs because it's very expensive to demolish buildings and replace them. And that phased retrofit scenario sort of sits in the middle where it's either the best performer or it's an okay performer across all 5 of those different criteria. So we've got 3 recommendations to make following on from this research. The first is that we should be retrofitting schools and not demolishing them. The second is that we need to be retrofitting sooner rather than later. And given that money is a massive problem and many of the schools we work on have insufficient funding to carry out even basic maintenance, we'd say tackle low-hanging fruit quickly, get an air source heat pumps as early as possible, and then carry out the more difficult measures over time. But that's going to be much more effective than waiting and then doing the whole lot in one hit in, say, 10 years' time. And our third recommendation is that we can take steps to minimise the embodied carbon of retrofit measures. And the ones you really want to focus on are PV, windows, and air source heat pumps. So I'm going to stop there. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through our study. So quite a lot of information.
That was fantastic. It was comprehensive.
Shall I stop sharing? Or do you want me to go back to graphs potentially?
Yeah, possibly, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to launch into some of the questions that have arisen. I usually start with a question myself, but actually your last couple of slides answered that, and it was about the balance between the the energy benefits of retrofit versus the non-energy benefits of retrofit, versus just putting a heat pump in. And I think your little smiley faces, or not so smiley faces, kind of tackled that. So I'm not going to ask that question.
Okay.
So Louise Clays has asked a question here. She's asking, do you have typical metrics you're aiming, I think she means targets possibly, you're aiming to achieve, space heat demand, energy use intensity, when drafting the retrofit plan for each school? So do you set out with the target in mind, or do you just...
Yeah, we have actually. So we are aiming for getting energy use intensity, so that's everything. Yeah, all your heating and non-heat needs, and at the meter to below 75 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. That's what we've been aiming for in our estate level planning. And what we think is, and the reason we're aiming for that is we think that's pretty achievable with pragmatic retrofit. So not as deep as these 5 schools were aiming for. With these 5 schools, we were getting them down to below 50, sort of 60-50 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. But by pragmatic, we're looking at replacing single glazed windows, definitely good roof insulation, cavity wall insulation, improved air tightness, MVHRS or seat pumps, but we're not talking about floor insulation and solid floors because that's really difficult to install. And we're not talking about internal wall insulation or external wall insulation, except in very discrete scenarios. So it's not a sort of NFIT style retrofit, is what we're aiming for on a lot of schools at the moment, simply because they don't have the money.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Okay,
they're trying to be a bit more pragmatic.
She asked a follow-up question here, which might be an opportunity maybe to sort of explain a bit more about how the whole life carbon is actually calculated. You'll understand when I read it out. So she asked, on Windows embodied carbon, did you include sequestration, which of course happens, the tree is the thing that sequesters the carbon, the product stores it for a period of time, as you pointed out. So saying, so timber frame would have a lower whole life carbon.
Yeah, we did include sequestration, but then that's comes back out again in life cycle C. So ultimately that sequestration over a 60-year study period. So it's so the upfront at A is lower if you've got a timber frame window, but by the time you then got rid of the window at the end of life in life cycle C.
How do you see the end of life issue? Because basically, you know, there are a lot of assumptions about the future in all of this modeling. If you're using a material which, you know, takes a natural material which has at some point in the past drawn down a certain amount of carbon into its structure, and now processing that and then extracting it from the forest or whatever will emit a bit of carbon. There'll be some waste, there'll be some materials burned, sawdust will burn, soil will be disturbed and oxidized. So there are emissions associated with using a natural material that has sequestered carbon from the atmosphere. But then you take it and you use it, and then something else happens with that land. It's replanted, or there's some other competition. So it's complicated stuff, and it's lots of assumptions. But how do you see carbon? Do you talk about it being stored in a building and you have to look after it, keep it safe, or how do you turn this into plain English?
Definitely. So, I mean, for the purposes of a study like this, the benefits of sequestration are not necessarily as evident, because you're assuming that timber window or that natural insulation decomposes at the end of its life and releases all its carbon. So in the kind of pure numbers in this study, you're not really benefiting hugely, except for in that cumulative emissions, the sort of sequestered carbon is only coming back right at the end in 2082. For pragmatic purposes, the reality of buildings is insulation going into a building is hopefully going to last an awful lot longer than 60 years. And so I do see it as a storage place for carbon. Absolutely, massively pro the use of natural materials in buildings. Even buildings that only
I mean, you made a point that materials obviously should be used because there are other factors like fire. Natural materials which create a fire risk is clearly a nonsense when you're trying to talk about net zero. Okay, so
I also, so just continuing a little bit on that, sort of putting sequestered materials into buildings, it's not just that they might be in a building for a lot longer than 60 years, it's also that we're getting the carbon out of the atmosphere now. And given carbon budgets, the impact of releasing carbon into the atmosphere now is is more important than, in a way, releasing carbon into the atmosphere in 100 years' time or 150 years' time. So we have to absolutely get that carbon out of the atmosphere now.
Yeah.
So another reason to put natural materials into buildings.
The ACB is going to publish a sort of short article trying to also look at this, thinking a bit more about what sort of products or materials deal with that. They sequester carbon much faster. So crop-based, annual crop-based building products such as straw seem to have some advantages, and trying to make that into an understanding what's the actual concepts in a meaningful way is quite a struggle, isn't it? So James Anderson has asked, what metrics or rates are you using for quantifying the embodied carbon of MEP equipment, air source heat pump, for example? I think you talked a bit about this. Was this important to consider in your study? It seems difficult at the moment to find reliable data. Energy services.
This actually is a really good question. So we used EPDs for manufacturers for the services, so for the air source heat pumps and the MVHR and the PV. So pH Ribbon, which is the tool that we use to calculate embodied carbon, has a pretty extensive database of manufacturers' EPDs, and then they also have sort of averages of manufacturers' EPDs and some generic data. So that's what we used to calculate services. But I will accept that in doing that, we only really calculated the embodied carbon of the key bit of kit, so the MVHR unit, and we didn't go into, within the main study, a huge amount of detail of, okay, what about all the ductwork and all of the switches and everything else that's associated with that kit. And we did do that when we did the embodied carbon study of the 3 retrofits that actually happened on site. We tried to do things like measuring the amount of ductwork and cabling and all that kind of stuff, and it's incredibly difficult to do and complicated. So we ended up using the RICS methodology, where you basically add in an uplift for the percentage of the works that you don't have actual data for. So in terms of cost terms, so if you've got data for, say, 60% of the cost of your MVHR system, but not for the remaining 40%, you add an uplift in for that. And so we did that in our more detailed analysis, and that lifted by a third to 50% on top the embodied carbon of the services. So, but that was a very, very cool tool, and I think it underpins the difficulty in getting embodied carbon information for services.
This next couple of questions is about financial appraisal, investment appraisal for these different measures, these different scenarios. Did you do investment appraisal, economic assessments?
We didn't do. No, the upfront cost side of it was quite crude. We didn't do life cycle analysis, and we didn't add in things like inflation for, the fact that it was.
You weren't getting into net present value calculations.
No, we weren't doing all of that, I'm afraid. What we did was a very crude sort of, okay, capital upfront costs. We knew it for the retrofits based on our heat decarbonisation plans or zero carbon action plans that we developed before and we'd had QS input on. And then for the do nothing scenarios and the air source heat pump only scenarios where we're putting in air source heat pumps and windows, we used SPONS rates for that.
So upfront capital cost, was that part of the brief from the Department for Education?
It wasn't. It was something we added in because we think this whole conversation around whole life carbon needs to be an awful lot. I mean, whole life carbon in itself is being more nuanced than only looking at operational carbon. And
I'm slightly surprised to hear you added in an economic assessment, because I'd have thought with any government, particularly this one, they would be.
Yeah.
Do they do their own? Can I ask a broader question about how the government has, how the department has responded so far, or responded or engaged during this process? Do you get a sense of what they're particularly interested in? Kate de Selencourt asking, for example, were the clients interested in improving indoor air quality? Now, I guess the clients are DFE as well as the schools. They're both.
Yeah, so everybody's interested in improving indoor air quality, but nobody has the money to do it, I think, is the short answer to that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's
so if I get into sort of government funding for decarbonising schools, these projects were done, 3 years ago the first round of public sector decarbonisation, and we could afford to put MVHR in under that system. Under the current funding system, we can't.
3 years ago, right? So another question I want about ventilation is COVID and ventilation rates and air filtering. Did that come into any of the discussions as you were working through this project?
Yeah, so as a result of COVID, an awful lot of schools were given air quality monitors to put in their classrooms.
All right.
They were just sort of sent out to schools across the country, but my understanding is that a lot of those monitors are not linked up to online sort of data platforms. So you have to go and take manual readings. So if you're there in the classroom, you can see what the reading's saying, or you go and take manual readings at points in time, which is obviously very disruptive and time consuming for people to do, and actually doesn't give you a good picture. For carbon dioxide levels in classrooms, the monitors are measuring carbon dioxide primarily, but sometimes also relative humidity, and carbon dioxide levels vary enormously over the course of a day. Like, they can just shoot up, and so you can't really just rely on sort of spot checks. You have to have you have to see the pattern over a long period of time, so you need to have that sort of online gathering that's happening on a sort of minute by minute basis.
When you did your
half hourly at most.
When you did your modelling of, say, heat loss, were you required to up the ventilation rate, specifically thinking about COVID particles? And
we did no, we didn't up the ventilator. This was in the PHPP. This was one of the assumptions we had to make that made a quite big impact actually on the operational energy sort of use or the space heat demand. And so we made assumptions based on what are DFE requirements for ventilation of schools in order to make those assumptions on ventilation rates for both naturally ventilated and then also the MVHR once it has gone in.
I can see that the usual,
rather than the reality of how well a school is ventilated.
Sure.
We have to make lots of standardized assumptions rather than this is exactly what's happening in that school at that moment in time. Okay,
I get it. There's a flurry of questions. I'm going to work through them. Magdalena is sort of coming back to this question of the air source heat pump versus the fabric. So she's asked, are air source heat pumps effective for energy use and comfort with a poor performing building fabric, poorly insulated building?
So it depends on how you define poorly performing. So we have a view that you've got to get your building air source heat pump ready. So there's going to have to be some minimal improvements to buildings, such as proper roof insulation and, draft proofing windows and things like that. I think the big issue here is around heat loads and what's your peak heat load? What sort of watts per square meter do you need to be aiming for to be able to make a building viable for air source heat pumps, from both the kind of making sure the air source heat pump can be as efficient as possible, but also from a comfort perspective. And we haven't really gotten to the bottom of that yet. We're kind of hovering around the 60 watts per meter squared mark, but I don't think we're there yet. So I'd love to hear if other people have got views on that subject of what you should be aiming for. But yeah, I know people who've put air source heat pumps into not brilliantly performing buildings, and it's improved their comfort because they now change the way they heat their building. They have their air source heat pump on, just putting low level heat into their building the whole year round. And then there are examples of air source heat pumps going into buildings that aren't very well thermally performing, and they've been a total disaster. So I think it completely depends on the way the air source heat pump's being designed and installed, and also how you then manage and use the air source heat pump.
Yes, I think one of the things that perhaps our deep retrofit focus over the years has sort of forgotten is the fact the building is a system, of course. And so we are talking about the fabric, we're talking about the heating system, we're also talking about the heat emitters.
Yeah.
In terms of making an efficient heating system. So question with you in schools, do you have access in a typical school to renew or to use underfloor heating or extra large radiators in order to, instead of going straight to the fabric, to make that heat pump much more efficient and therefore much cheaper to run? It's
very difficult to do that. So putting
Right.
in underfloor heating is very disruptive and expensive, and putting in much bigger radiators is often problematic because classroom walls are really tight on space. There's a huge amount of storage, a huge amount of artwork, a huge amount of stuff that goes onto classroom walls, and you've already got to try and, so with doubling the size of your radiators isn't necessarily going to be that easy. You also need to think about if you've got radiators that can be reused, you've got to then balance off the cost of insulating the building better or replacing the windows with the cost of upgrading radiators so they're much bigger. What we are finding though is in a lot of schools you kind of have to replace radiators anyway because the heating distribution system is so old and in bad shape. So it's a very nuanced question as to what in cost terms is better, but from a long-term sort of thermal comfort and energy security perspective, clearly improving the fabric is better than just putting in bigger radiators or underfloor heating systems in order to be able to manage better,
It's interesting seeing what the limitations are in schools, trying to understand your room for maneuver when you're trying to consider all these integrated measures. Okay. So Debbie Morgan has asked, well, she said, excellent presentation that did seem to cover everything. Her only question is, how do we get this information across to the appropriate people, organisations with the right influence? I would assume you would say the DFE will disseminate this far and wide and the job's done. Or...
Yeah, so we are just starting to disseminate it. Lewisham Council very interested in disseminating this research. The DFE, we've already done one presentation to them. We're about to do another, so I'm hoping that the DFE will disseminate it more widely. And I'm really hopeful that this is impacting on the way they think about the criteria for demolishing buildings, because that's my big concern at the moment. Is the criteria for demolishing buildings is often about how well that building's maintained.
Yeah.
So if a building comes up in a national condition survey as having bad roofs, bad windows, bad wall cladding, oh, let's demolish the building. And actually you can replace the roof, you can replace the wall cladding, you can replace the windows. What you can't replace is, say, a building that's, so full of rack it's about to fall down. Maybe that's a reason for demolishing a building, or a building that's so riddled with asbestos that you can't touch it without a massive health hazard. Maybe those are reasons. But just because roofs have been badly looked after for 20 years does not mean you should demolish whole buildings. So yeah, our hope is that our conversations with the DFE might have changed a little bit the thinking in, how you choose which buildings get demolished in schools.
I'm going to answer the next two questions in reverse order, actually. James has said, what database do you use for your grid-based operational emissions? And I think the answer is PHPP has that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant PH Ribbon.
Yeah, no, so actually for operational emissions, so what we did is we used the BEIS, DESNES now, carbon factors. So we looked at the 2022, 2021 carbon factors, and then we looked at the National Grid future energy scenarios, and we took the future energy scenario for steady progression without carbon, sorry, what's it called, BECS.
Bioenergy with carbon capture and...
Yeah, exactly, without carbon capture, that one. So we took that particular scenario, and then the problem with that, the future, sorry, I'm getting very detailed now, but the problem with the future energy scenarios from the National Grid is that they only look at generation. They don't look at transmission and distribution and well to tank in their figures for how the grid will decarbonise between now and 2050. So what we did is we then made an uplift to those figures to allow for transmission and distribution and well to tank, based on the uplift that we've seen over the last few years under the DESNES figures. So that's how we did it.
So you did.
That's all in the report.
Okay, fine. Let's go with that. It's in the report. Yeah. Okay. So Nigel Quinton has asked, slightly surprised that scenario 2 is similar to scenario 3 in WLC. How do they compare on cost? Is the cost of retrofit balanced by the need for a smaller air source heat pump?
I think in terms of cost, I think it's a case-by-case question, because you really need to look at how much further do you need to go in a school to have a big impact on your air source heat pump, and it's that balance, isn't it? About how much more do you want to spend on insulation to reduce the cost of your air source heat pump? So I can't really answer that cost. In this particular study, the costs were typically a bit lower for the air source heat pump only scenario than for our retrofit scenarios. Now, I just want to point out the reason our retrofit scenario was similar in whole life carbon to our air source heat pump scenario, and I did say this, but it's worth kind of reinforcing it, is because we did a phased retrofit approach. So not all of the buildings decarbonised straight away. It took 8 to 10 years for that whole retrofit to take place, and it's the parts of the school where we weren't introducing retrofit measures and not putting in air source heat pumps into for 6 to 8 years, that we're making a massive increase in the operational carbon emissions over the first 5 years, if that makes sense, 5 to 6 years or 5 to 10 years. So that's why those two scenarios don't look that different. If you retrofit today, it's substantially better than putting an air source heat pump in just today. I'll go back to the slide to explain this. Where was it? This one. You retrofit today, your whole life carbon is lower. Sorry, if you retrofit in 10 years' time, your whole life carbon is an awful lot higher. So it's the importance of timings is the point I'd like
and
to
that's
make.
because of the operational emissions.
Yeah, because the emission savings
built
you
up in
make.
preceding years.
Yeah.
Okay. It might be worth keeping on this graph actually. So somebody's asking here. It's quite a long question, and maybe it should be the last question actually. Come on, where it's 1:05. It's a question about your definition of deep retrofit versus benefit.
Yeah.
Was any analysis undertaken on the costs of doing deep retrofit versus Enefit? I think you mentioned the costs were prohibitive for Enefit.
Yeah. So I don't think we did like serious analysis of what it would take to get these schools to Enefit. The analysis we did was what are the measures we can do to fit within the government funding thresholds, basically. And when you're struggling to get cavity wall insulation and MVHR into government funding thresholds for decarbonisation of schools, you're definitely going to struggle to, say, do full EWI or IWI to a building in order to get it and, get your air tightness levels down to below 1. So that's where it came in. But I have to admit, we didn't do a deep sort of Enefit analysis of the buildings.
Actually, on the question of air tightness, because it is quite an important thing, both for energy and comfort, but also from just the practicality of what's possible. Did you end up thinking that did the schools manage to achieve a kind of, did you find a balance? What was a reasonably practical air tightness target for schools? Have you got a general rule that's
Right. So air tightness is really difficult. It's very difficult to do air tightness tests in schools because they all have asbestos all over them. So we haven't been doing air tightness tests. And so we can make a visual assessment of air tightness and also talk to people and know from, oh, this particular classroom's really leaky, or that, those windows particularly bad, and we can therefore make improvements. So for example, at Myatt Garden, they'd had this warm roof installed only back in 2018, but a very brief visual inspections pointed out that there were gaps all over the roof. I mean, literally you could see air coming, you could see daylight. And so we massively improved the air tightness of that roof to make it effective. But we couldn't go around and measure it. So we can't say, well, we know for sure that it was, 20 ACH beforehand and now it's only 5.
So this is rather taken me by surprise, actually, but I can see the logic of it. So a school which is drafty, with asbestos, presumably dust, historical dust, hidden away in the crevices, presumably drafts are moving that air around through those gaps.
Yeah, but it's different to pressurizing an entire building.
Absolutely. So
that's the concern.
Yeah.
Basically.
So you're saying that no, any school where asbestos is identified has never been air pressure tested?
Oh, I'm not saying that. I'm saying we're avoiding doing it because of our concerns about it. I don't know, to be honest, if people have managed to air pressure test schools with asbestos in them, but it's something.
So you identified this as a risk and decided you wouldn't take it. Is that right?
Yeah, and that was on the basis of talking to people who do air tightness testing.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to point out that on asbestos is was still going into buildings up until 1999. So effectively, any school with a building pre-1999 in it, there's a high chance there's asbestos in it. We pretty much every school we go into has asbestos.
Okay. Last question then. Kate de Selincourt has asked, have you considered assessing air tightness via CO2 decay in an unoccupied room?
We haven't done it yet.
Excellent.
And then also there's the pulse testing as well, which we need to look at. We're going to have a whole airtightness session actually in about, this is the kind of exciting company we are, our Christmas day out. We're going to learn about airtightness.
That doesn't
testing.
surprise me at all. Yeah.
So
It sounds great.
hopefully
Can we
I
come?
might be able to answer that question a bit better once we've, and maybe we'll start doing it.
Okay, well, we'd love to have you back, actually. Perhaps we could talk about that next time. Okay, well, look, thanks for your time. That was really interesting. You've had loads of supportive, thankful comments in the chat. So lots of brilliance and great presentations, amazing work, all this sort of thing. Very good. So,
Well, thank you very much. That's really nice to hear. And thank you for asking us along.
great. Well, keep up the good work and